The night was quiet, the kind that felt almost too still. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows over the empty road as the hum of the car's engine echoed in the silence. He wasn't a man who spooked easily. Years of high-risk operations had hardened his instincts. But tonight, something felt off. He first noticed it in his rearview mirror, a black sedan creeping along a few car lengths behind him. At first he dismissed it as a coincidence, just another late-night driver heading in the same direction. But then came the turns. Left, right, another right. No matter which way he went, the sedan mirrored his movements precisely. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. He had been trained for moments like these. Never react too soon, never let them see you rattled. He exhaled slowly, running through his options. He could speed up, test if they followed. He could pull over and confront them. Or he could do what they least expected. Stay calm and let them make the first move. Then, without warning, the sedan's headlights flashed blue and red. A normal person might have felt relieved, assuming it was just an unmarked police vehicle. But to him, those lights weren't reassurance. They were a red flag. He had worked with law enforcement long enough to know that undercover units didn't operate like this. Not without backup, not without proper protocol. His heart rate didn't spike, but his mind sharpened. He had two choices now: comply and play along, or test the waters and see just how real these so-called cops were. Whatever this was, it was far from a routine traffic stop. And something told him that the men in that car had no idea who they had just pulled over. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The moment he eased his car to the side of the road, a heavy silence settled over the night. His fingers hovered over the ignition, debating whether to cut the engine. Every instinct screamed at him that something wasn't right. But he needed to see how this played out. The black sedan stopped just behind him, its high beams flooding his rearview mirror with blinding light. He kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was already racing through possibilities. Were they actual cops, highway robbers, or something worse? Then the doors opened. Two men stepped out, moving with a confidence that was a little too practiced, a little too rehearsed. No uniforms, no badges, just plain clothes and a cocky arrogance that instantly put him on edge. The taller one, broad-shouldered and wiry, adjusted his jacket as if concealing something beneath it. The other, shorter but stocky, walked with an aggressive stride, his jaw clenched tight. One of them rapped on his window with the knuckle of his index finger. Too casual, too smug. "License and registration," the taller man demanded. "No good. Evening?" No introduction. Just a command delivered in a tone that suggested he wasn't used to being questioned. The protagonist turned his head slowly, studying the men through the glass. Their stance was wrong. Real cops, especially undercover ones, didn't act like this. There was a rhythm to law enforcement interactions, a level of procedure these two weren't following. He cracked his window an inch. "Who are you with?" His voice was calm, steady, laced with just enough authority to test them. The shorter man's jaw twitched. "We're undercover officers. Routine check. Just hand over your ID." He let the words hang in the air. No unit name, no badge flash. Just a flimsy excuse and an attempt to bulldoze through his resistance. That was red flag number one. Red flag number two? The way they positioned themselves. The taller one had drifted slightly toward his rear bumper, angling himself near the blind spot of his side mirror. Classic flanking maneuver. The shorter one leaned in closer, his fingers unconsciously tapping against his thigh. A nervous tick? Or was he signaling something? They weren't here to write tickets. They were here for him. But why? The protagonist shifted slightly, just enough to let his right hand rest casually near the center console, near the emergency response button installed beneath his dashboard. He kept his face neutral, his movements unhurried. "You guys have a badge?" he asked, voice deceptively smooth. The taller man scoffed, exchanging a glance with his partner. "You don't ask us questions. We ask you questions." Ah, there it was. A real cop, even an undercover one, would have handled that differently. There would have been protocol, paperwork, proof. These guys? They were improvising. The shorter man lost patience. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped. "Now!" And just like that, the energy shifted. They were done pretending. The protagonist inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He could play along, step out, let them think they had control. Or he could force their hand, expose their intentions. Either way, this was going to end on his terms. But one thing was certain. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. The air between them grew heavier, thick with the kind of tension that only came before something went very, very wrong. The protagonist didn't move, didn't flinch. He just let the silence stretch, watching the two men closely. Waiting, measuring, calculating. "You didn't answer my question," he said finally, his voice even. "Who are you with?" The taller man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a flicker of annoyance passing over his face. "I told you, we're undercover. You don't need to know more than that." A thin smirk tugged at the corner of the protagonist's lips. "That's not how this works." That was the first crack in their confidence. Real cops, especially undercover ones, didn't hesitate to state their unit. They knew that transparency, within limits, kept them credible. These guys? They were bluffing, and now they knew that he knew it. The shorter man took a step closer, just a little too fast, a little too aggressive. "Listen, man," he said, voice lowering into something meant to be threatening. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. You're acting real suspicious. Hand over your ID and step out of the car." The protagonist tilted his head slightly, as if considering the demand. In reality, he was noting every detail. The flicker of nerves in the shorter man's eyes, the controlled breathing of the taller one, and the unmistakable shift in posture. They were getting desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. "Sure," the protagonist said casually, reaching toward the glove compartment. But then he paused, his expression unreadable. "Actually, before I do that, why don't you show me your badges?" Neither man moved. The taller one gave a dry, humorless laugh. "We don't have time for this." "Then make time," the protagonist shot back smoothly. His tone hadn't changed, but the authority in his voice had sharpened. "No badge? No ID? That's not a cop, it's a liability." The shorter man clenched his jaw. His right hand twitched, barely perceptible, but the protagonist caught it. A reflex. He was reaching for something. A weapon, a fake ID, or maybe a signal to his partner. There it was. Confirmation. This was not a traffic stop. It was an operation. A setup. A test. And he had just flipped it back on them. Slowly, the protagonist leaned back against his seat, exhaling through his nose. His right hand, still unseen by the two men, inched closer to the concealed emergency response button under his dashboard. His other hand remained in view, relaxed, unthreatening, but deliberate. He knew how to play this game. He had played it many times before. The taller man took a single step back, as if reassessing. The shorter one, however, was still locked in, focused, stubborn, and twitchy. The kind of guy who couldn't stand being challenged. The kind of guy who was about to do something stupid. The protagonist let his eyes drop, just for a fraction of a second, to the shorter man's pocket. A subtle movement. A test. And just like that, the man reacted. A sharp inhale. A tense shift of weight. a flicker of hesitation before his fingers twitched toward his jacket. Got you. The protagonist's muscles coiled beneath his calm exterior, ready for whatever was about to come next. Because now, there was no doubt. These weren't cops, and this wasn't going to end peacefully. The protagonist didn't panic. He didn't tense up. Instead, he did what any seasoned professional would do when walking a tightrope with an unknown threat. He stayed calm and let them hang themselves. Without breaking eye contact, his left hand moved slowly, subtly, toward his phone resting on the passenger seat. A practiced movement, rehearsed over years of experience. With a single swipe, the screen lit up, the camera app opening without a sound. He didn't need to aim. The front-facing camera was enough to capture everything. Still, he played along, outwardly cooperative, inwardly hyper-alert. "All right," he said, raising his hand slightly. "Let's clear this up. You say you're undercover. What precinct?" The shorter man blinked, caught off guard. The taller one recovered first, folding his arms. "That's classified." Classified? That was laughable. No real cop would say that. He leaned back in his seat, tilting his head slightly. "Huh. Funny. I used to work with some detectives. Never heard of a traffic stop being classified." The shorter one's fingers twitched again. His agitation was visible now. The protagonist pressed further. "All right, maybe precincts. A touchy subject. How about this? What's my infraction?" The taller man scoffed. "You were driving erratically." "Erratically?" the protagonist echoed, a slow smirk forming. "Huh. That's interesting, considering I've been driving the speed limit for the last 10 minutes. No sudden turns, no swerving." He let the words sink in, then raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Silence. A hesitation. A crack. The fake cops exchanged a brief glance. The shorter one clenched his jaw. They were losing control. Then it happened. The slip-up. "Look." The taller one sighed, his voice softening, trying to pivot. "We're just doing our job, all right? We got a call about a suspicious vehicle matching your description. Black, sedan, out-of-state plates. You get how that looks, right?" For the first time, the protagonist let his expression shift. Not in fear, but in amusement. "A call?" he repeated, voice low. "That's interesting. Because earlier you said, this was a routine check. Now suddenly you got a call?" He let the words hang in the air, watching them squirm. "Which one is it?" The shorter man stiffened. The taller one froze. They had messed up. The protagonist exhaled, shaking his head. "You boys really aren't good at this, are you?" That was it. The moment everything changed. Because now? They knew he knew. The air between them shifted. It was subtle, like the first crack in a dam before the flood. But the protagonist caught it. The hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty, the way the shorter man's fingers twitched near his jacket. They weren't just uncomfortable now. They were nervous. Good. He had spent years in high-stakes situations, working with men who knew how to control fear. These two weren't those men. They had walked into this confrontation expecting an easy target. A civilian. Someone who would fold under pressure. Instead, they had found him. Still, he didn't move too fast. Desperation made people dangerous. He exhaled slowly, letting his posture relax, just enough to make them believe they still had control. Then he reached toward the glove compartment. Deliberate, measured. The taller man stiffened. The shorter one's hand practically hovered over his pocket, trigger fingers itching. The protagonist paused, barely concealing a smirk. They were jumpy, sloppy, easy, he murmured. "Just grabbing my registration." He popped the glove. Compartment open. Inside, a neatly folded stack of papers, a flashlight, and something else, tucked beneath a panel. They didn't notice. Good. He pulled out the registration, holding it between two fingers. "Here." The taller man snatched it away, barely looking at it before handing it to his partner. The shorter man's eyes darted across the paper, scanning it as if he actually knew what he was looking for. But his hands were shaking. And that? That was his confirmation. These weren't trained professionals. They were criminals playing dress-up. The protagonist let a slow smile creep onto his face. "So," he said, voice smooth as glass, "what happens now?" The shorter man looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Well," he shrugged, shifting in his seat. "If you're real cops, you're supposed to run my registration. Call it in. Standard procedure, right?" His gaze flicked between them. "Unless, of course, you can't." The taller man's jaw tightened. "Don't get smart," the protagonist chuckled. "Too late for that." Silence. Heavy. Tense. The fake cops were unraveling. Their act, their control, slipping right through their fingers. Then the protagonist did something that made the shorter man visibly flinch. He leaned forward, not aggressively, not threateningly, just enough to shift the power. "Tell me something," he said, voice quiet but dangerously steady. "What's the plan here? Shake me down? Steal my car? Or were you hoping I'd step out so you could make me disappear?" The shorter man swallowed hard. The taller one squared his shoulders, trying to salvage authority. "Enough! Step out of the car!" The protagonist sighed dramatically. "All right," he said, reaching for the door handle. But as he did, he let his foot slip slightly off the brake. The car rolled. It was barely an inch, but it was enough. The shorter man jumped back. His reaction? Pure instinct, and that told the protagonist everything he needed to know. These guys weren't just frauds. They were scared frauds. He fought the urge to smile. Instead, he nodded, feigning submission. "All right," he said again, hands raised slightly. "I'm stepping out." He wasn't. He was setting the trap. For a moment, the world held its breath. The protagonist's fingers rested on the door handle, but he didn't pull it. Every muscle in his body was poised, not in fear, but in control. He could see it now, clear as day. These two weren't ready for what was coming next. "All right," he said again, voice calm. Deceptively calm. The shorter man shifted on his feet, eyes flicking toward the taller one, waiting for instruction. That's when the protagonist knew. This guy wasn't the leader. He was the muscle, the enforcer. But the taller one? He was the planner, the decision-maker. So that's who he went for. The protagonist exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You know," he said, almost conversationally, "I was hoping you two were better at this." The taller man blinked. "What?" The protagonist chuckled, low and deliberate. "Come on. This whole act? It's sloppy, inconsistent, amateur hour." A flicker of unease crossed the taller man's face. There it was. "First, it was a routine stop," the protagonist continued, his tone shifting, controlled, commanding, like a predator circling its prey. "Then, it was because of a call. Now you're just demanding I get out of the car without any probable cause?" He tilted his head slightly. "See, the problem with lying is, it's hard to keep your story straight." The shorter man gritted his teeth. The taller one clenched his fists. They were losing their grip. Time to finish this. The protagonist leaned forward ever so slightly, his next words slicing through the cold night air like a blade. "I'm going to ask you one last time," he said, voice dropping into something deadly serious. "Who are you?" Neither man spoke. The protagonist sighed, shaking his head. "Fine," he said, stretching his fingers. "My turn." "And then?" He dropped the bombshell. "Names redacted," he said, the name rolling off his tongue like a switchblade being unsheathed. He let it hang there, watching the recognition bloom in the taller man's eyes. "Former military branch, federal agency." Special operations. Counterintelligence. He leaned back against the seat. And you? You just tried to pull a scam on the wrong guy. The shorter man visibly paled. The taller man's mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to say something. But his brain hadn't caught up yet. They had messed up. Badly. Silence stretched between them, thick with realization. The protagonist let them sit in it. Let the weight of their mistake crush them. Then he shifted gears. Now, he said, voice sharp as steel. I believe you were asking for identification? He cocked his head, smirking. How about you go first? The shorter man actually took a step back, fear creeping into his bones. The taller one hesitated, thinking, calculating. But it was too late, because they weren't in control anymore. He was. A heavy silence hung in the air, but the protagonist wasn't tense anymore. He was in control. The two imposters? They were drowning in their own fear, scrambling for a way out that didn't exist. Because what they didn't know, what they hadn't even considered, was that the protagonist had already called for backup. Long before this conversation had started turning against them, his emergency response button had done its job. The real police were en route, and they weren't coming for him. The taller man was the first to break. His eyes darted toward the road behind them, his fingers twitching slightly. He could feel it, the noose tightening. We're done here, he muttered, stepping back. Let's go! But the protagonist didn't move. He just smirked. Oh? Leaving so soon? The shorter man didn't even respond. He just turned. Spinning on his heel, he made a break for the sedan, reaching for the driver's side door. Big mistake. Before he could even grab the handle, the protagonist was out of the car. Fast. Precise. Years of training kicking in like a second nature. He moved before the shorter man could react, before his partner could back him up. A single swift motion, a well-placed hook to the wrist sent the shorter man's hand smashing into the car frame. He yelped in pain, staggering back. The taller man panicked. He reached into his jacket. One final desperate move. But the protagonist was faster. His knee shot up, striking the taller man in the ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs before he could pull anything out. He crumpled to the pavement. The shorter man, still nursing his hand, made a second mistake. He lunged, sloppy, untrained. The protagonist stepped aside at the last second, redirecting the man's momentum, sending him sprawling onto the asphalt. Sirens. Bright red and blue lights flooded the street. The sound of screeching tires as multiple squad cars boxed in the scene. Game over. The real officers stepped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The two fake cops, their faces drained of all color. They knew what was coming. And the protagonist, he, simply dusted himself off, turned to the approaching officers, and smirked. About time you got here, he said. And just like that, the wannabe cop's worst nightmare had become reality. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pavement, casting long, jagged shadows as the real officers took control of the scene. The two imposters were face down on the ground, cuffed, their pathetic attempt at authority now completely shattered. One of the officers, a seasoned-looking sergeant, approached the protagonist, giving him a once-over. You all right? The protagonist nodded, brushing the dust off his sleeve. Yeah, better than them. He nodded toward the two men now being dragged to their feet. The sergeant's radio crackled. Got an ID on these guys, a voice confirmed from the other end. Multiple priors, fraud, armed robbery. Oh, and get this. One of them is wanted for impersonating law enforcement in 3 other states. The sergeant whistled low. Looks like you caught some real scumbags tonight. The taller man didn't even lift his head. He just stared at the ground, defeated. The shorter one, however, couldn't help himself. You think you're a hero? He spat. You think you're better than us? The protagonist chuckled, shaking his head. Not with arrogance, but with certainty. "No," he said simply. "I just don't make stupid choices." The shorter man glared, but the fight was gone. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. As the officers hauled the men toward the squad cars, the protagonist exhaled, finally allowing himself to process what had just happened. It could have gone differently. If he hadn't trusted his gut, if he had let his guard down for even a second, he could have been another victim, another headline. But he hadn't. He had stayed sharp, kept his cool. And because of that, two dangerous criminals were off the streets. As he turned back toward his car, he glanced at the camera on his phone. The entire encounter recorded. Proof, evidence, and more importantly, a warning for anyone watching. He looked straight into the lens, his voice calm but firm. Always trust your instincts. The screen faded to black. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.